Hi, Brian Hipple here, and today I want to talk to you all about system administration and why it's not really a part-time job. Today we're going to talk about what a system administrator does, including upgrades, security, performance, cloud-based systems, a particular case study and what basis learned, RAD tools with the triple D there, and then we'll summarize. Keeping your system up to date, reliable, secure, and good performance is probably the most important role of a system administrator. And what does all this entail? Well, there's hardware, the hardware aspect. Are you giving the end users the performance they need? OS, are you keeping your operating system as secure, bug-free, and fast as possible? And software, are you keeping your applications as secure, bug-free, and fast as possible? Hardware upgrades. Technology upgrades make your system more efficient and more reliable. Your processors, 64-bit, allow for more than 4 gig of RAM to be used, which of course increases performance. Memory, more memory decreases swapping, which is swapping in and out of memory from disk. More memory increases performance usually. Drives such as SSD can be used basically as memory and increase your I/O performance over typical hard drives. Of course, there's various types of hard drive that have different options and features and benefits. And other considerations are graphics, network cards, peripherals, etc. A system administrator typically manages a number of OSs for a number of machines. Device types such as servers, desktops, tablets, phones, etc. There's a lot of different types of devices nowadays. Newer and latest versions. Is your OS still supported by the vendor? I know we have several customers and even sometimes in-house where our OS is older and it's really not supported by the vendor. And what does that mean? That means you are no longer receiving security updates. And that is a big deal. Where we have ransomware and viruses and hacking. You really want to have the latest and greatest just to make sure that you're as secure as possible. And are you running the bit level that matches your processor? Because a lot of 64-bit machines will still support 32-bit OSs and 32-bit processes, but you really want to match the bit level of your processor. Does your software support your OS version, right? So that's another one. You're running old software, but on a new OS version. And that's one thing a system administrator should make sure that you're running software that is supported by your OS. Patches. Are you keeping your system secure and functional as possible? Usually you want to turn on automatic updates. Windows does it the first Tuesday of the month. I know the Mac OS checks periodically, and if there's one, it'll notify the users to go ahead and download and install it. Software upgrades. This is where an administrator can spend a lot of their time. You really want to get the software on the newer and latest versions. Again, is your software still supported by the vendor? If not, you're not getting the security updates that we talked about, and you really do need to check with your vendor and make sure what version are they at. We have customers that are surprised that we're at version 22. Our versions follow the year, and it's 2022, so we have version 22 of BBJ available. Does your software support your OS version? So again, you may be running newer software, but on an older OS. So you need to check that as well. And patches, a lot of us see patches like when you run an application and it'll say, hey, there's some new updates for this application. Do you want them? Usually you do, and keeps your application secure and functional as possible. BBJ-based applications can take advantage of the bus, which is the basis update system. And basically it's a web service that's available to everyone who installs BBJ. So you can run your bus service that's running on your system, and then you can provide updates to your application, to your customer base. Arista takes advantage of the bus framework in order to make updates available to its end users. Let's take a closer look into the bus. As I mentioned earlier, the bus is an update or patch registration delivery web service, and it's installed with BBJ. It facilitates getting software patches to BBJ applications. Since it is a web service, it's not only consumable by BBJ applications, but also Java or any other language that supports the consumption of a web service. The registration of the bus updates are stored in the basis DBMS, and it's administered by the bus admin program, which is what you see here on the left. As you can see, you can specify the updates. It has a database tab to configure the basis DBMS database that we're using for the bus administrator. You can configure emails, which can provide automatic notifications of when an update is available. And you can also configure users, such as administrators that can configure the bus updates, or just guest users which can read and see what updates are available. As you can see, the first field is the vendor. So this can be any string. In this case, we're using a vendor code that Barista understands to be basis. And then you give it an application. In this case, it's ADB, which again is a code that Barista understands to be the Barista application. You specify a version. What version is this update for? In this case, it's for version 21. And the next is the level. And what this is just an ordinal number. It basically says, what patch is this? What patch level is this? It starts at 1, and for example, we're at 7 on this one. That means there were 6 previous patches, and now this is the 7th one. It pertains to the date of when the patch is to be made available, and the size of the patch. And the next field is location, and this is actually the most important field of a bus update. This is a URL of a publicly available site that can be used by your application to download the update. In this case, we are using a cloud bucket that's with the URL bus.base.com, and that could be any jar or any kind of archival that can include many files into it. And then there's the comment, which you can put a comment about what's in this update and whether it's active or inactive. So that's on the server side. So on the client side, for example, here's Barista on the right-hand side. And the application can do whatever it wants to for checking for updates. It can be automatic, it can check once upon startup, but a lot of applications do what Barista's doing here, which has under help check for updates. So when you check for updates, you can see the very first couple of fields is the company and the product. And then what version is it currently running? It's at version 21, but our patch update level is at 0. And remember, it was 7 that's available now. And the last time it checked was early May. Here's the location of the jar, and it's saying it's at level 7. So now I know there's been 7 updates from my version of the software. Now, does that mean I have to get 1 through 6 before I get the 7th one? No, you do not. It's cumulative. So if you get the 7th patch, that includes 1 through 6 as well. It tells you the date, the size, and any comments that were generated. Security has to be the most important part of a system administrator's job. Using secure connection, SSL, TLS, newer version of SSL basically, your SSH, when you're shelling into a remote system, really should be using a private public key offering. That's how most of these work, where the private key is used for decryption and the public key is used for encryption. And the private key is per user, and it's usually on a user system. Of course, using secure connections subverts packet sniffing. So you don't want to be on an HTTP site with the HTTP protocol instead of HTTPS and put in your username and password, and then all of a sudden that someone's packet sniffing and they see it and they've got your credentials. So that's why I usually use HTTPS in a browser to avoid those kinds of things. Denial of service attacks. That's been in the news a lot lately, and that really comes mostly into play when your system is internet facing. So if you have an internet facing application, you really do need to take this under advisement. And the things you can do to limit the denial of service attacks is you limit your connections. And if you start your service for like BBJ service, for example, by systemd or inetd params, they have params that you can set for how many max simultaneous connections do you want to accept? Max per source. So one entity can't just take down your system by connecting thousands and thousands of times. And a lot of times what companies do is they put an intermediary machine between the server and the internet. For example, we do this with AWS CloudFront. So for example, if it's the server that the customer's connecting to or then users are connecting to becomes overwhelmed, then you can switch it out for another machine that still goes to the correct backend machine. Authentication. Of course, that's a big one, right, of sysadmin. We have that, when you run something at the OS level. For example, on Linux, do you want to run as root or non-root? BBJ services, you run as root, well then everybody who connects is actually getting the permissions as the OS level user that they're connected as. If they don't, they're not actually an OS level user, they get nobody's permissions. Or you can run it as a particular user. So if I run BBJ services at bhipl, then everybody connects, no matter who they are, get BHIPPO permissions. So it just matters what your organization, your application wants to be configured as. And there's the keys I was talking about before, the public for encryption, private for decryption. You have user password authentication. You have BBJ authentication, which of course is set up in EM, where you add user names and passwords and the various roles and what they're allowed to see and what they can't see. So we also have application authentication. Most of our applications now have a login screen where a user puts in a username and password. They can use the admin API to use the BBJ users that are defined in Enterprise Manager, or they can do their own custom authentication. We have our hosts. That's kind of an older mechanism, not as secure, but basically you put in your IP address and users for a particular user in an rhost file that tells what users can act as that user and from what machines. And then, of course, we have tokens, which Jeff Ash talked about in a separate presentation. Okay, cloud-based systems overview. Cloud-based systems, often referred to as cloud computing, can significantly ease all aspects of an administrator's job while saving money. How does that work? Well, you can run applications without installing them on your own computers. You don't have to go buy hardware. So it's a really nice way to test different configurations to figure out what you need for your application. And basically it allows you to store and access information via the internet. So it doesn't matter if your customers are just in the US or the East Coast, the West Coast, or Europe or South America. It really doesn't matter. So you can get the information and your applications to the end users that need them. And as I mentioned before, it really does enable the testing for different configurations. What type of hardware is the best? Did you try it on a Windows server versus a Linux server? Well, hardware too. So you can say, oh, okay, so maybe I tried it on a 2 CPU machine versus an 8 CPU machine. A lot of times it's going to really depend on the application and whether it's IO bound or memory bound. And that's another thing that I should have mentioned here is, changing out memory settings, see how that affects your applications and come up with criteria that your application needs. You want something to happen in a certain amount of time. You want a certain amount of users on the same time, simultaneous. And then come up with a configuration, OS hardware, memory configuration that does your needs and your end users' needs. One of the best things is it's very highly scalable. And what do we mean by that? That means as resources are needed, you can add them. And as they're not needed, you can take them away. Especially with the internet now, you may have end of the month, that's a very big deal. So you can up your processing power at the end of the month versus the beginning of the month, and then only pay for the machines, the increased speed and the increased memory and all that as you need it. So it is very, very scalable. Although there are a lot of vendors in the cloud computing arena, these are the top 3. You have the Microsoft Azure, mostly just called Azure, Google Cloud Platform, GCP for short, and Amazon Web Services, which is probably the most touted and most used, AWS. Basis uses AWS for all of our IT needs. Development, I use it particularly. I have a Mac, so if a bug comes in that's Windows specific or I'm doing something specific for Windows, for example, building a desktop app executable for Windows, I can start up a Windows development machine that has Eclipse on it, that has Java on it, and then I can do all my development and testing on that box when needed. We also use it for building. We have a continuous building system called Jenkins here at Basis. And so when an engineer checks in code, it automatically builds the whole BBJ system and install and packages it up for testing, which is really, really nice. We don't have to tell anybody, hey, it's time to go build or anything else. We just check in and AWS machine sees our check-in via the Jenkins system and kicks off a build. We also use it for testing, and this is probably one of our number 1 uses of our AWS machines. Again, we support a lot of different OSs, a lot of different JVMs, and so we can bring up AWS machines as we need them for testing and test on the various platforms. We also use it for production. We run add-on software for our ERP system here at Basis. And so we use an AWS machine for it, which is great for backups. It's great for anytime we need to up the processors or machine types. We can change that out. It's really good to take images of, snapshots. In fact, we'll take a snapshot of production and then use that image to run a testing instance. So we have the exact setup of our production system to test on. And of course, we use it for storage. If you've ever been to our download page to download BBJ, all of our BBJ packages are stored in the cloud, normally called buckets. Okay, so here's just an image. This is of our West Coast region. So you have different regions, and these are all of our instances that we're running. As you can see on there, the third one down is our test system, the upgrade.basis.com, and then it's running, and then we have our production server, which is also running. But you can see we have several different images. Some are running, some aren't, but it gives you the current status, and it's one of those things that AWS, there's a lot to it. But the good thing is you're taking advantage of the AWS folks who really know security, know machines, know processors. So basically you answer quite a few questions, and then you can try different instance types, take snapshots, but it has a very good UI that allows a system administrator with some training to be able to run different machines. Now we're going to talk about a case study for Basis. Well, a lesson that we learned just recently. I was the project manager for getting out the BBJ22 release, and as have you heard in other sessions, the BBJ22 release includes the BLS, or Basis License Service, which has a new license type. So in preparation for this release, we had to upgrade our production system to be able to generate these BLS licenses, which they're new. We also had to change our request for these BLS licenses in the install, admin, auto, and when you use the update liceverb. The license generation system, the LGS, we're going to call it here, that is our system that actually creates the license upon those requests. And it's built of scripts, BBJ programs, and the Basis DBMS. This also includes that we want to use the BBJ and BLS22 release candidate, because we believe in our eat your own dog food kind of thing. We always test our release candidates on our production system and release before we actually release it to the public. We also want to upgrade to Java 17. That's the latest and greatest Java that we now support in BBJ 22. Previously, we supported Java 11. Now you can run Java 11 or Java 17, but again, we want to try out the latest and newest technology, so we're going to upgrade to Java 17. And that kind of left us with a question, what cloud machine type should we use? So after the development was completed, we started testing on a cloud machine, and we set up the same configuration as production. Again, we probably just took an image of it and started up another instance as our test box. And again, what do we need to do? We upgraded Java, we upgraded BBJ and BLS to the 22 latest release candidate, and the license generation system. Testing showed that a BLS license was taking up to 10 seconds, and we wanted this time to be around 2 to 3. And why is that? Well, the reason is that a user, when they request a license, either in the install or admin, the actual end user is waiting for it, right? So we really want to be about that fast, and that's about what the current BLM license or the older BLM license took, which is about 2 to 3 seconds. So we wanted to be comparable, but it was taking 10 seconds. So what do we have to do? We have to determine if this whole process of generating the license, was it memory, disk, or processor bound, or maybe all three. So how did we figure this out? Well, we started changing out the machine types and determined, with different machines, some had more processors, more memory, faster disk, until we figured out what it was bound to. And we figured out that it was bound to processors. It used a lot of processor speed and processor time. So we found the correct machine to get the process under 3 seconds. And what was great about that is switching out the machine types, we didn't have to go buy anything. You just rent them. And for the amount of time that we were renting, we're talking pocket change. It's just not that expensive. Of course, cost is one of the things you always take into account. But in this case, we found one that worked. I think it was an 8 processor system that worked for our needs, wasn't too expensive. And so that's what we were going to go with. Okay, so our next step was to upgrade the production system. We decided to upgrade the system piecemeal, meaning that, remember I told you we had to upgrade the LGS, the license generation system, BBJ, we wanted to upgrade Java, and we also wanted to change out the machine type, right? But we want to make it also safe as possible. So we're going to do them piecemeal. We're going to do one at each time. Okay, so we started with the license generation system, and then we're going to follow with the updates to BBJ, Java, and then upgrading the machine type. Since we use a cloud-based system, we created a snapshot of the current production system as a backup. So we're ready to upgrade. So how do we upgrade? We First thing, you always want to be able to get back to where you started. That should be your worst point, is getting back to where you started. We made an image of the test cloud machine, which included the new LGS, right? So now we created an image that included the new scripts, any BBJ programs that were changed, and any changes to the database. Well, and then we were ready to upgrade. And was the upgrade successful? Unfortunately, no. Well, all that preparation, and we thought it was going to all work, but what happened? Sometimes reality really bites you, and in this case it did. The generated BLM licenses were not valid. How could that be true? We were monitoring the server log files for the requested BLM licenses and the BLS license types, right? The BLM are the current and the BLS are the new. And all seemed well because we were monitoring the server logs. We could see that they were being requested and returned. However, we didn't actually test to see if the return license were usable. Wow. Wrong approach, right? We took the inside-out approach instead of testing outside in. Meaning that, we thought if we tailed some log files and said, yeah, they're getting created and they're getting returned, no problem, then we were good. But in actuality, we really should have taken the outside in and saying, okay, what is the customer experience? What is the end user going to see out of this upgrade? And so we really needed to actually request a license, install it, and make sure that license was valid. Because the problem was, it wasn't a valid BLM license. We changed the format at some point to the tamper resistance license, and it wasn't in that format. Then users would end up with a nag message saying it's an invalid license for all those who updated their license during that time we had upgraded. And of course, customers had done that, had requested BLM license, and had experienced this license error firsthand. Okay, so we had to downgrade our production system back to its original state. So we brought up the new instance with a snapshot that was taken before the upgrade. LGS was back to its original state, and the BLM licenses were working again because they were in the right format. So we did analysis of what went wrong. We determined fairly quickly that it was a script issue. And of course, then we had to meet with management to discuss the issue, which was determined that we were going to notify the affected customers, and we did. What lessons did we learn here? In the future, we'll take outside-in approach and focus on the end-user experience. Testing current functionality, the BLM license should have been tested first because there was nobody out in the field that was already requesting the BLS licenses at that time because this was before we went out with the RC. And so we should have really made sure that those licenses that were requested actually worked for end users. We needed a quicker determination of issues. It turned out that monitoring server logs wasn't sufficient, right? And we should also communicate with tech support for any reported customer issues. We found out about the same time that they were invalid when customers started reporting that there were issues. But to keep in touch with those that are in touch with the end user is critical when you do upgrades because they may see issues that we haven't seen yet. However, on a silver lining note, having a snapshot was a good way to back out. Right? We instated the snapshot within minutes of the discovery. No need to manually try to back out changes, which, those of people that make direct changes on production, that's very hard to do. But with an image, you just swap it back out. You can be up very quickly. And we knew everything was going to be in a good state, even though, of course, we tested as well. Okay, so what's the latest status? The script issue was fixed. We did successful testing of our license generation system, and a new image was created, and we upgraded production with the new LGS. BLM licenses tested first, right? Outside-in approach. And then we tested the newer BLS license second, and everything was working just fine. Subsequent individual updates were made for BBJ, so we then updated BBJ, made sure everything was working, right? Piecemealed it. Then we upgraded Java from 11 to 17, and then we boosted the machine type from a 2-processor system to an 8-processor system. And now we're ready to support BLS licenses. Now we're going to talk about RAD tools. The triple D there. Everybody's used to the RAD with 2 Ds, the Rapid Application Design Development, but we're adding deployment as a third D. And Basis makes it really easy because we have zero and non-zero deployment possible. What does that mean? Zero deployment of web apps and DWC applications run in a client browser. So there's no other software that's needed on a client machine before you run these applications. And with desktop apps, we have zero and near zero deployment GUI applications that run on the user's desktop. in the sense that 0 with Windows, and we'll talk about this more later, we actually have a Windows executable that runs so that you don't have to have any Java, pre-existing Java installed, whereas on Linux and Mac you would, which is the near 0. But in this session we're going to look further into desktop apps. Desktop apps, why do we need them? Well, in Java 11, support was removed for Java Web Start, which is a way to deploy your applications with BBJ by providing URL, and the needed resources were downloaded to the client desktop and run. But Basis now provides this functionality with desktop apps. And we really want you to get to Java 11 at least, if not Java 17, because Java 8 has security issues. They're no longer providing patches, and you can also save Oracle licensing fees. What is a desktop app? Well, as we mentioned, it's a replacement for Java Web Start, or JNLP, as that was the file type or configuration type for a Web Start application. The applications run on a desktop computer, and all this is made possible by the Basis class loader. It downloads resources to the client, and it's used in conjunction with SSCP. And it allows for the nesting inheritance of class paths, and it's also independent of Basis's class paths. So your application can use separate classes than what is needed by Basis. Java Web Start was never a perfect solution. Why is that? Well, there was a few things. The complication was very, very complicated. And they had so many settings for the JNLP file, the configuration files, and most were not needed or even used for BBJ applications. A Web Start security certificate had to be generated, included when running the application, and the jar files had to be signed before downloading to the client. Client side. With Web Start, you had to have Java WS, or Java Web Start, software previously installed on client machines. And any invalid configuration could result in the application not working, and their cache that they used, they had jar cache, could prevent execution. So if you had an upgrade and you didn't clear your cache, many times it would fail. And validation of the jars and cache would take time. The startup time was fairly slow, and had to download full jars from the server. Desktop apps overcome Web Start limitations on the server side as well. Enterprise Manager now provides simple configuration. It only shows settings that BBJ applications may need, not any Java. It's not a generic solution for any Java application. It is for BBJ applications. And when we started this process, we started from ground zero. And we really said, okay, we're not going to use Web Start or JNLP files anymore. What do Basis end users and administrators actually need? And that's the only thing that went into EM. And if you've never used a desktop app or created one, it is so simple. And we're going to show a demonstration here in a little bit of how to configure one and run one. And you'll see how simple it is. We don't want a Web Start security certificate. It's no longer needed because we don't send jars. We don't send full jars to the client, just classes. So there's no longer a requirement for jar signing. And why is that a big deal? Some jars are huge. We had a customer that had a jar file that was over 75 meg, and if you use just a few classes from that jar file, well, the whole 75 meg jar needed to be downloaded to the client. Well, if you're only using a few classes now, it just downloads the class files that you need, and in their case, it went from a need of 75 meg to about 2 meg on the client, and that's orders of magnitude faster. And on the client side, no existing software is necessary. You don't need a Java WS program pre-installed. All you need on non-Windows OS is just Java. Again, on Windows, we actually download a Windows executable. So again, it's part of our zero deployment. And so you don't need no existing software just to start running a desktop app on a client's machine. Client side, there's no configuration needed. You don't have a Java WS that has all the configuration or what Java to use, which area to use. None of that is there. No jar cache for user to clear. Remember I said sometimes you got problems with Web Start and you had to clear it. And class cache is used to provide efficiency. Again, just downloading the classes needed, not a whole jar file. Utilizes it to download the classes at runtime. Desktop app URLs. Each configured desktop will have a unique URL for each client OS. So there's URL for Windows, Mac, OS, and Linux. In fact, there's Windows 64-bit and 32-bit. We realize that some folks are still on the Windows 32 OS, so we are still supporting that for now. Mostly there's the three major Windows, Mac OS, and Linux desktop apps. The URLs can be sent to the end users by administrators, And also, we have hyperlinked apps that are displayed and selectable on the Jetty start page. So as you configure your desktop apps or your web apps in EM, they'll be shown on the Jetty homepage. And it's a well-kept secret. The Jetty web server is included with every BBJ installation and has a default homepage that lists your web and desktop apps. And there it is. Look at that. So if you've never gone there, it's just localhost. If you're using HTTP, it's localhost 8888. If you're using HTTPS, then it's localhost 888443, and that'll direct you to the home page. And then if you click on the apps, the second button up there on the top, then it'll show you all your web apps on the left, which are either the BUI or DWC, or in your desktop apps on the right. With desktop app URLs, it downloads a single installer executable for client desktops. It's either a Windows executable for Windows clients, or on non-Windows it'll be an executable jar. The installer will then download the necessary JRE that's configured in EM that you want the users to use to run their application, and it'll also download BBJ and application resources as needed. It also creates a native application to run the BBJ program, and these are used to run in subsequent invocations. It also creates a shortcut to run the native application, and the user is prompted to run the native application after installation. The desktop app native application will vary depending on the desktop OS, right? So on Windows, it's going to be an exe. On Linux, it's going to be a shell script. And on the Mac OS, it's going to be an app. In the example there, it's always going to be installed under the user home directory. And then whatever app name, for example, this is in the user home directory, users N Smith. And then the name of the app, in this case is add-on. And then on Windows it would be add-on.exe. On Linux, user home, add-on shell, and the Mac OS, it'll actually be a Mac OS application. Okay, so the running native application, it's always going to be kept up to date, which is far superior than what you had before with WebStart, because you'd have to go repackage it every time you got a BBJ update or a Java update. It's going to download, install the desktop app information, and it's going to download the startup jar that's needed from the server. So as that changes, as you upgrade BBJ, it'll automatically be downloaded and used. It performs a detection of the JVM, and if necessary, it downloads and installs the JVM. And mostly that'll be a JRE. I mean, you can use a JDK, but JRE is the smallest that we need to run. In EM, it shows you that you really should select a packaged JRE, usually a zip for Windows, tar for Unix and Mac. Okay, so it runs the BBJ program using the JVM jar desktop app information. It applies the specified Java, BBJ, and program args, and writes all activity into a log file. So if there's ever an error or you just want to see what's happening, there's always log files on the client side. Okay, so here's Enterprise Manager. The URLs in there are displayed for all apps, which is web apps, which are DWC or BUI apps. We're talking about desktop apps in this, which could be GUI or CUI applications. And this is where an administrator can go and harvest the URLs and send them to end users to run the application. Java runtime environment. This is the JRE list. Added JVMs. You can add JVMs for Linux 64-bit, Mac OS 64-bit, and Windows 64 and 32-bit Windows clients. So this is where you go add the JVMs that you want to use for your client desktop. We do have designated defaults, which is being shown here, but you can also overwrite these defaults in the individual app configuration. This is the big benefit. Oracle used to control Java upgrades on your client computers. Now you are in control. And that used to be a problem before, because if it said, oh, hey, you have a new update for Java, and then they update Java and you haven't tested your application with that, who knows if it's still going to run, right? But now you can wait and test whatever JVM that is supported by BBJ, and then you specify it in this list, and that is what the users are going to use, regardless of what other JRE or JDK may be installed on their machine. Here's the Jetty homepage again. Remember, it displays all the available web and desktop apps. Clicking on the hyperlink, application name will either run or download the app. If it's a web app, it'll just run it. If it's a desktop app, it'll download the installable executable or jar. And when the desktop app is downloaded, all you have to do is open the downloaded file, which will be named install app name desktop app, and again it'd be the exe or jar, and that'll automatically install the app for you. What new enhancements for desktop apps are in BBJ 22? Well, For one, we've updated the splash window. The graphics look much nicer and much more professional now, although it does still show the progress as it did in 19. Automatic addition of Java 17 args. With Java 17, they're now modular, which means that you have to add command line Java arguments for packages that are, in their opinion, not always used. And so we automatically add the Java 17 args that are required for those packages, and it's applied during the desktop app installation. Client-side resources. By default, remember we were saying we still have a cache on the client to make it really fast, so it's already there, it doesn't have to download it again. By default, this cache is stored on the user directory. Well now, if you don't like that under the user directory, you can specify it with an environment variable set on the client or a Java property, which can be specified in the EM for that application. And the environment variable is called bj cache-dir, or the Java property is the common basis startup remote cache.dir property. User sharing is also optional with a true or false environment variable or a Java property. And what this means is if you have multiple users using the same client machine, for example, like terminal services or some kind of environment like that, you can now choose to share this cache, and it won't be on a per user basis anymore. And you just set that with the true or false environment variable, the bj cache shared or the common basis startup remote cache shared Java property. What are some desktop app enhancements for the future? Client-side resources again. We're going to have the ability to allow the sharing of a JRE. Usually this is not necessary because you usually have one desktop app that you want to run. But in the cases where you want to run many desktop apps and you'd like them to share the same JRE on the client machine, we're going to allow this, as we do with the other client-side resources, by sending an environment variable and or a Java property. We're going to have the ability to create a distribution, and we're going to show a demo on this in just a few minutes here. And it's a new option in Enterprise Manager, and it allows the manual customized deployment of the desktop app. Many of you have a way that either via Windows Server or you have your own way to deploy applications and you'd rather not use a URL. We're going to have it packaged, and it's much like if you ever used the old JNO PEXE packer tool, where it packages everything up and silos everything into one package, and so you can grab that directory and somehow get it to the client machine however you want to, and now you can run that desktop app. We're also going to allow for setting all options, because we do have most of the options available, but not all. One of them is controlling where the desktop app is installed. Right now they're always installed under the user home app name directory, but you may want to install somewhere else. For example, on Windows you may want to install under program files. And optionally create the desktop shortcut. Some people don't want the desktop shortcut for whatever reason, and that can be optional as well. But again, what do you all need? Tell us what the basic community needs or wants, and we'll be sure to look at that as enhancement. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and do a desktop app distribution demo. Now I'm going to demo how easy it is to create a desktop app using Enterprise Manager. Again, we are very excited about this new technology. We started it from ground zero, started from scratch, figured out what is going to be the easiest and most used configuration, as well as speeding it up with only downloading class files and not validating full jar files. So we're really excited about this. And if you haven't used a desktop app yet, you're going to see how easy it is to configure one. So the first thing you want to do is run Enterprise Manager, come down to Web, and you want to go to App Deployment. And the first thing you want to do is you want to configure the desktop app JREs. And you're going to want to add one for each type of OS that you want to support on the client. So for example, I've already added a JRE for Linux, Mac, Windows 64-bit, and Windows 32-bit. Usually these are going to be in the gzip or zip or tar formats, because you do want them packaged up because they are going to be sent to the client. And you want to use the JRE instead of a full JDK, because JRE is much smaller than a JDK, and it's all that's needed to run these applications on the client. The next thing you want to do is go under Applications. And as you see, we have no applications created yet so far, but let's create one. How do you do that? You click the Add a New App button. And the first thing you want to do is give it an application name. We're going to call this Admin API Demo. Then the next thing, what program do you want to run? What's the BBG application going to run? So we can browse for it. And this is under the install under BBX demos. And you all have this as well, as long as you installed the demos with BBJ under BBX See, BBX, there we go. Demos. And let's go down to demos. And I'm going to go to admin API. Okay. And there's our BBJ program. So I'm going to go ahead and select that guy because that's the guy we're going to run. Now, optionally, I could browse to a config file. If you don't specify one, it uses the default config.min, and that's fine with me. I could also optionally set the working directory. I want to use the default interpreter user. If not, I can specify another user. And the default interpreter user is just the OS level user that's running the application on its desktop. You can also override the host and the port if you want to, and specify an SSCP, program arguments. If you have any arguments to your program to run it, in this case, I have an API demo, doesn't need it. You can specify a shortcut name in case you don't want to use the application name. So you could put in API demo if you wanted to. You could also say what it does. You know, this program runs the admin API. You can also specify a shortcut image, which is the image that's associated with the shortcut, and a load image, which is actually the splash image. But if you don't provide a load image, it'll use the BJ default splash screen. You can also specify the quiet mode and whether it's enabled for BUI, DWC, and desktop app. Okay, we have a section here for web app only, and it has quite a few things like CSS, show confirm, what terminal you're using for the web app. But since we're doing a desktop app here, we're going to continue scrolling down. And what can we set for desktop app? Well, this is anything you can set by default from the command line. And this can be Java arguments. It can be, if you want to override the JREs that we specified in the defaults, you can do that. The -A, the -N, remote host, and so forth and so on. One that I like to set is the terminal. Because by default it uses terminal T0, which is not an invisible sysconsole. So I'm going to go ahead and put T2 there. And I'm going to save that. Now once I save that, I can either hit launch desktop download, or remember that BBJ startup page that we showed? So if I refresh this guy and I go to apps, sure enough, there's my desktop app link, so I can just run it from there. So I'll click that. That's going to download a Windows native executable, and simply all your customer has to do, or end user has to do, is open it. So I double click that, and it actually installed it. Okay, it says, now do you want to run it? And I say yes. And sure enough, it runs it. You can connect to it, and there it is. And how easy was that? So, and you can do that with any BBJ application in here that runs in GUI or CUI mode. Okay, so I want to show a new feature that's going to be in BBJ 2210, and it's called build distribution. What that is like, remember the old JNLP exe packer where it built everything up, you pointed it to a certain web start application and build everything? Well, now we're going to have it inside of EM, and it's going to be as easy as this. You're going to say click build distribution button, and it tells you, hey, save the distribution to the /BBX, which is the install directory, app distribution, admin API demo directory. So let's go take a look. After we created the distribution, it gave us a message box saying what directory was saved to. So we've just browsed to that directory in File Explorer, because this is a Windows machine. There is, under the BBJ install directory, an app distribution directory. And it's going to have a distribution for each OS that you have a JRE configured for. So in this case, a Linux, Mac, Windows, and Windows 32, I had them all. But this is a Windows box, so let's just go ahead and go into the Windows. And this is the directory that you're going to want to copy and get to your client machine however you deem possible. So I know some people have servers that push them out, or just copy them, or whatever you do. So, but let's go ahead and go into this directory and see what's in there. So there's a bin directory, and that's where, of course, the native executable is located. And we can also go to the CFG, and that's the JSON, which has the configuration for that particular app. Any images, the JRE directory, this is where the JRE is installed for that application. Lib, there's the one jar that's needed to actually run a desktop app. Okay, and here's the log directory, and this will be important for any time you want to check activity in the air and the out. Okay, so let's go back to the bin directory. And like I said, this is a fully self-contained folder. So for example, I'm on a Windows 64-bit machine. So if I go ahead and run this guy, sure enough, it's going to run it, my BJ application, that quickly. And there you go. So look at that. So now you have a fully self-contained folder that you can get to the client machine, much like the old JNLP exe packer did. And again, that should be in BBJ 2210. So in summary, A system administrator is not a part-time job. They're responsible for upgrades, security, performance. We talked about cloud computing, cloud-based systems, went through a basis lessons learned case study. We talked about the RAD tools with the triple D, with deployment being the third D, and we went through a demo of how to use desktop apps. And I'm going to leave you today with a great quote. If you don't like change, you're going to like irrelevance even less. And that's from Army General Eric Shininsky. And remember, the health of your production environment is critical to the success of your application and to your business as a whole. Thank you.
In keeping with the theme that system administration is not a part-time job, let's take a look at what's up with Oracle and Java licensing. In this session, I'll review Oracle's Java licensing update and present the options that you have to ensure that you are both in compliance to Oracle's terms of use and you are secure. You do have options, but when should you be making those decisions? The short answer is now. I'll present a cost comparison of your choices, and we'll take your questions at the end of the session, so jot them down. Back in January of 2019, Basis presented the original Oracle Java roadmap in a Java break. At the time, Oracle stated it would release both Oracle Java and OpenJDK Java, which were essentially identical at release time. The roadmap included interim and then long-term support releases, while the open source community provided long-term support versions of OpenJDK. Along the way, there was a name change on the open source product to Adoptium's Temurin. More on that 2019 roadmap. Java 8 and Java 11 required a fee-based Oracle subscription in order for you to receive the critical security patch updates. The last free patch update for Oracle Java 8 was provided way back on January 15th, 2019. It's noteworthy that the Oracle subscription is priced per named user. More on that later. Fast forward to September 2021, when Oracle modified their original roadmap. This is what you need to know today. Oracle announced a Java no-fee terms and conditions license, partially reversing their earlier pricing structure for the production use of Java. They're now allowing production use of Java 17 and higher LTS Oracle JDKs for a limited time following their release. For Oracle JDK 17, this will be until September 30th, 2024. This doesn't affect, however, the OpenJDK or pre-17 versions of Oracle Java. It only applies to JDK 17 and beyond. Are we confused yet? So what does this mean to you? This isn't new ground for Basis, as we have been supporting BBJ on other JVMs from HP and IBM for many, many years. So Basis will support BBJ on both Oracle's JDK and OpenJDK. It may be that you will need to upgrade your BBJ in order to be supported. Note that Java 11 requires BBJ 18.2 or higher, and Java 17 requires BBJ 22 or higher. These are available, of course, at no cost with your SAM coverage. Though Oracle is driving these changes, you do have options. If you stay or have stayed with Java 8 or go to Oracle Java 11, the old rules apply. Those rules are you must have a contract with Oracle or you are running without any of their security patches. That is high risk. If you elect to update to Oracle JDK 17, it is free until September 2024. And thereafter, you need to take the update to Java 21 or pay the Oracle subscription. What Basis is providing is access to OpenJDK or new Java versions with your SAM or with upgrade fees. It's worth repeating. If you're staying with Java 8 or Oracle Java 11, you must contract with Oracle for the security of your applications and your customers. Your BBJ SAM eliminates the Oracle Java support fees entirely and enables the use of either OpenJDK 11 or OpenJDK 17. Should you be concerned about just who is providing support for OpenJDK? It's really not much of a question. The Adoptium working group includes companies like IBM, Red Hat, Azul, and Microsoft Azure, just to name a few. You're in good hands. So again, what does this mean to you? Basis is committed to providing a smooth transitionary path for its customers in order to accommodate Oracle's changes. Basis will provide BBJ support for both the commercial Oracle JDK as well as OpenJDK versions of Java. Here's a 55 user cost example of your choices. The Oracle Java SE subscription requires, remember, named users, and these would be your general costs. We've got 2 servers, database server and your app server, using their numbers with a 8-core Intel machine, plus $2.50 a month per named user, and all that comes out to a little over $4,000 a year. Adding your Basis SAM, it ends up a little over $6,200 a year. Over on the other side, the Basis SAM is delivering OpenJDK. First of all, the Basis user count, as you know, is structured by concurrent users. So, in this 55 user example, the number of concurrent users would be less. So we've used a very conservative count reduction to 51 concurrent users. That pricing comes out to be just under $2,200 a year. That's a third of the price. Along the way, you receive, with your SAM, the latest BBJ technology and support, and all the SAM-dependent features such as database and file replication, data change auditing, asynchronous triggers, the Google-like full-text search delivered by Lucene, the BB Jasper report viewer, the digital dashboard, and so much more. So you decide. Basis SAM with the OpenJDK at $2,200 or Oracle Java subscription at $6,200. Now that you understand the current landscape, just when should you make that decision? Again, the decision time is now. If you're using Oracle Java 8 or 11, you should already be contracted with Oracle. Or you should already be using OpenJDK available at no cost with your Basis SAM coverage. And what's the risk? You're missing critical security patches, and if your users have inadvertently updated the Java 8 on their machines, they are in contravention of Oracle's licensing terms. For further reading, check out the knowledge base article Basis and Oracle Java Licensing at basis.com. There is the direct URL, or you can search on the Basis site. I've also provided the Java Break URL to that YouTube going back to the original Oracle Java Break. So in this session, we've covered Oracle's Java licensing and reviewed your options. We've reviewed the technology landscape and presented you with the definitive reasons why Basis SAM is your best choice for a long list of reasons, including price.